Today I'm returning to Final Fantasy VII with a look at the odious corporation at the heart of the central story, Shinra. Now, while much is made of the fantastic cast of Final Fantasy VII, from its central hero Cloud Strife to its enigmatic villain Sephiroth, all of which I've discussed to some degree or another in the past, I think a really unique aspect of Final Fantasy VII is to have forged this world and setting around this monolithic company that is at once a faceless and all-encompassing force, but also periodically drilled down to and explored on a departmental and individual level. And indeed, it's interesting to note just how many characters have actually worked for Shinra in the world of Final Fantasy VII, and I'll expand on that shortly. But the premise of the company, looking at Final Fantasy games in general, is interesting for a number of reasons as an antagonistic force, since in Final Fantasy games we often have evil empires or creatures that are disrupting an otherwise peaceful world and upending the status quo, whether it's Niflheim in Final Fantasy XV, Gestal or Galbadia in 6 and 8, or Sin in Final Fantasy X. But what we have in Final Fantasy VII is this dubious company, Shinra, who on the one hand play into this evil empire trope with the militaristic arm of Soldier, for example, but on the other hand are in many ways the backbone of society. It's very much like the dystopian novels of the mid-20th century, like 1984, where we find ourselves in a very prescriptive society that is shaped around this all-encompassing governmental or big brother sort of entity, wherein the citizens don't necessarily know any other reality or indeed are actually convinced that this new reality is a good thing. But rather than some dystopian government that has bought up all of the means of production, as per the communistic critiques of this early modern literature, Shinra is interesting in how it's the adverse of that. It's a private enterprise that has progressively bought its way into different sectors of society, from weapons development through to energy, and eventually kind of funded its way into the levers of power and the government instead. So, very interesting inverse critique there that I've touched on in the past, and some might argue is not a million miles away from energy lobbying today. Now, I think in my first review of Final Fantasy VII, I mentioned how Shinra, as this domineering, multifaceted company, is a huge component of what shifted Final Fantasy VII away from the high fantasy stuff that we saw in the first 5 to 6 games, and into this sci-fi influenced dystopia. And I think 6 was very much a bridge between the old and newer Final Fantasy, as I've discussed in the past. But indeed, if we look at the wider world beyond Shinra, and beyond the high-tech Midgar, like Nibelheim, like Cosmo Canyon, like Mediel, they do retain the essence of these high fantasy towns that we might see in earlier games, but it is Shinra's Mako production, and their reactors specifically, this sort of industrial revolution that sees places like Junon built. Junon is a prime example because of course they've built over a formerly quite rural small town there that's become known as Lower Junon, and this is what really pushes Final Fantasy VII into the realms of the modern, the technological and the science fiction. So that's really the unique aspect of the world and setting of this title that sets it apart from its predecessors. But taking a step forwards into story now, again, it's interesting to see just how prevalent Shinra is in its inclusion to the plot. And indeed, just looking at our motley cast of heroes, they are bound together in part because they have all been adversely affected by Shinra's actions in one way or another. But more so than that, it's interesting to note that almost half of them, looking to Cloud, Cid, Reeve and Vincent, they all are or have been employees of the Shinra as well. So we have this curious ecosystem of Shinra influencing and touching on everything, including the characters we consider heroic or good, and naturally the wider events and character backdrops that bring them together, such as massacring Barrett's hometown of Corel, destroying Cid Highwind's dreams, leaving Yuffie's family and the people of Wutai destitute, experimenting on Vincent, seeking out Aerith, and so on. All of this sort of orbits around Shinra and brings the party together. So In all, very interesting in how pervasive this entity is in the world of Final Fantasy VII. And really, although many might reasonably suggest that Sephiroth is the primary antagonist of the game, because he is the immediate threat to the planet, while Shinra is this secondary antagonist in the form of Rufus and his executive party, we should also consider that Sephiroth is a product of Shinra too, a product of their experimentation. And while he is rightfully elevated in stature owing to his strength, his enigma, and his threatening demeanour over the course of the game, along with his personal influence upon Cloud's story, of course, as well, we should remember that without Shinra, and more specifically without their funding and enabling of characters like Professor Hojo, who I've discussed at length in the past, and how actually really integral to the game's villainy he is, Sephiroth wouldn't exist at all. And so there's a clear case that all the ills of Final Fantasy VII's world, the destroyed lives from the Mako reactor bombings, the plate bombings, and the mining of natural resources, and of course the creation of threats such as Sephiroth, we can quite reasonably argue that all of this stuff and all of the ills of the world in a macro sense are the fault of the Shinra, and Shinra is responsible for that. So very interesting how everything in a sense sort of roots back to them. So I thought Shinra, for these reasons, was a fantastic entity and contribution to the world that shaped so much of the villainy of the Final Fantasy VII experience. But regarding something I've noted in the past, which is Final Fantasy's, and specifically Final Fantasy VII's ability to interweave and bridge sincerity with the silly and drama with comedy, which I've explored recently, discussing characters like Cloud and his goofiness in wearing a dress and so on, or Cid demanding that people drink tea, or Red 13 disguising as a Shinra guard and so on. Shinra is not without its ability to elicit laughs and indulge the absurd and the comical as well. And while, for all intents and purposes, they are complete bastards, particularly looking at that top table with Heidegger, Scarlet, Hojo, and so on, we also have characters like Palmer, whose every inclusion and scene indulges this sort of stupid evil that takes the edge off the severity of the Shinra. And perhaps the best example is following our boss fight with Palmer, because he sort of pokes fun at us and then he runs away only to get hit by a truck. And I think Square going to that amount of effort to show this silly little vignette on the battle screen shows how important it was for them to balance the severity of the evil with this sort of silliness and this comedic element, bringing that to the forefront of the action as well. And the reason this is important, I think, is that by introducing humorous idiots to Shinra, it prevents the entity taking itself too seriously and becoming one of these parody stock villains who are sort of funny for the wrong reasons. They're funny because they are hammy, fall into this sort of stereotype. Look at villains of 80s action films or fantasy films, for example. The second thing it does, by introducing characters like Palmer, like Heidegger, is that they elevate the genuinely serious characters, such as Rufus, through contrast. And so Rufus's stoicism and cold reserve is amplified when he is set beside these lesser characters. And to a broader degree, looking at the macro story, the severity of Sephiroth is amplified as compared to Shinra 2, even accounting for the cool pragmatism and leadership of Rufus. Now, one thing I've noted in the past, and I've been reminded of again on my current playthrough, as I'm playing the remake and the OG game simultaneously at the moment, is how the citizens of Midgar and the surrounding world perceive Shinra, because, again, in stark contrast to the evil empires of other Final Fantasy games, which are generally regarded as bad by basically everyone in the game that isn't the Empire. Every town and village they invade and occupy, so on, they're considered as antagonists. The storyline for Shinra involves slightly more nuance and complexity in how they worked. For example, it's one of the first instances we see of propaganda and disinformation actively being used by Final Fantasy antagonists, and also among the first in which we see the antagonist content to harm their own citizens, as well as those that they're trying to invade. So, for example, we have scenes where President Shinra is commenting on how they can use Avalanche as a scapegoat and to blame following their initial bombing mission, which Shinra, of course, sabotaged to create much more damage to the populace and sort of create this fear-mongering, which was amplified and shown more thoroughly in the remake. And perhaps the most devastating action that Shinra take in Final Fantasy VII proper is dropping the Midgar plate in order to destroy the Sector 7 slums, which shows this callous disregard for human life and their own citizens, and their willingness, I suppose, to obfuscate and create strawman enemies out of people like Avalanche, out of Wutai, and whoever else to sort of craft and suit their narrative, which again is alluded to some degree in the original game, but is really amplified and taken to new heights in the remake material, where, for example, we see Scarlet making an announcement to the populace on the big TV screen, which is very sort of dystopian 1984 style stuff. And, of course, the disingenuous broadcasting of Avalanche in the reactor just before the Airbuster battle. So, really interesting dynamic there, where Shinra is attentive to both the war of public opinion and also the literal battles against its tangible enemies. Although actually, something that we see change over the course of the game is the respective approaches of President Shinra Sr. and his son Rufus, since in his inaugural speech to the party, Rufus says that he's not bothered about this intricate, costly campaign over public opinion and would rather rule through fear. And while we don't necessarily see the fruits of that in the original game, I think because there has been a renewed focus on the actions and the intentions of Shinra in the remake, maybe we will see a bit more of the public reaction to Rufus and his new style of leadership a little bit more, as of course the original game mainly focuses on Rufus trying to get to the promised land and that sort of thing. Now, just to wrap up on the public opinion thing, and something I really quite like is that in the original Final Fantasy VII there was quite a conscious effort to show the positive perceptions of Shinra as well, which is quite unique, as I say, for the Final Fantasy games. And particularly once we'd left the drama of Midgar behind, and upon reaching the village of Calm, it's at this location that we see about half of the NPCs in the town comment on the convenience of Mako and how great it is and how great Shinra are, while a handful of others sort of lament the impact on nature and the animals that are dying because of Mako, and so on. So I really liked Calm as the second main location we arrive at, because it's this microcosm that shows in a nutshell the fundamental division in perception on both Shinra and Mako production. And indeed, with regards to Shinra, Calm has even greater significance when we look to the wider compilation material, and specifically before Crisis, since, much like the Nibelheim incident, Calm was accidentally or inadvertently destroyed and rebuilt by the Shinra years before, and the survivors of that attack were the preliminary test subjects for Hojo's work. So quite interesting sight there of Shinra's sprawling history of corporate crimes and genocide. So, as I say, I think there's plenty to discuss about Shinra, because there's so many individuals that comprise it and it's influenced so much of the world and setting. But I suppose, to wrap up on a couple of points, firstly, the dichotomy of Shinra is that so many characters who are posited as protagonists have also worked for this company. To some extent we have Cloud, Vincent and Sid, as we've mentioned, but more particularly I think we have Zack Fair, who, rather than leaving Shinra, like most of the others did, is for the most part an active element of the company until right of the end of Crisis Core. And I think firstly, his story is interesting because we come at it initially viewing entities such as Wutai and Avalanche as antagonists and as bad, and the story thus broadens the belligerence on both sides into shades of grey, more than Shinra arbitrarily bad and everyone else good. And we also have Angeal and Genesis and Sephiroth as Zack's closest comrades, which are a huge humanising aspect to the company's military arm, which we hadn't previously seen to this extent, prior to the release of Crisis Core. And I think the remake has stayed faithful to this to some degree by offering shades of humanity to certain elements of Shinra, including Reno and Rude, for example. and also conversely shows the factionalizing and the fracturedness of Avalanche, which is glimpsed in the remake, and I'm sure will open out once we get into Rebirth and subsequent games. But also with Zack, like many character arcs found in war media and war genre literature and media, particularly around World War I and World War II, stuff like Band of Brothers, Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks, and perhaps most notably recently, All Quiet on the Western Front, which was a great novel that's now a movie. And the similarity with these is that Zack seems to have entered Shinra with a really rather idealised worldview about what Soldier First Class means and what it's all about. And on Shinra's part, they've built this fantastic sort of mystique and propagandistic patriotism for the company, or at least for the soldier unit, that many have subsequently aspired towards, particularly off the back of Sephiroth's reputation. So Cloud Strife is another classic example of that. As he explains to Tifa by the well, he wants to join Soldier and be awesome like Sephiroth. And so much of Zack's story in Crisis Core is reconciling the myth and this sort of fabrication with reality as to what being a hero is all about. So really great work there, and I look forward to seeing how that's elaborated upon in the remake. And I suppose my final point is just that they have expanded upon and adapted Shinra's villainy over the course of the remake and other instalments to sort of change perspectives and change perceptions of what the company is, and at least what the individuals that comprise it are all about. And for my part, actually just referring back to the goofier, comedic, executive level characters, it's interesting to see how they've been adapted, because so far, Palmer, who is an absolute clown in the original, like everything he says is ridiculous, in the remake he comes across as much more articulate and fretful in his fleeting appearance in the remake, which admittedly isn't very extensive, while we have Heidegger, who was certainly posited as incompetent in the original game, but in the new one seems much more cartoonish in his villainy so far, which I actually quite like. And as for Scarlet and Hojo, the former is basically exactly how I imagined her, even in the original game, while Hojo is clearly much more sinister and genuinely villainous than his original outing. And for example, where we had the comedic reprieve of him in the Costa del Sol in the original game, I find it much harder to picture this new iteration and this new portrayal of Hojo kind of sunbathing, because he is that much darker in tone. And as for Rufus and President Shinra, I thought they were both great. Again, Rufus maintains that suave severity and the David Bowie vibes that I think are really integral to his character, and I won't dwell too much on him because I have discussed him at length in the past, and he's one of my favourite characters, so don't want to labour too much on that point. But very faithful, and I think they've maintained the severity of Rufus, which is really important. So that's my subjective take on the updated rendition of the exec characters, who are very much the nucleus of this corporate evil in both the original and the updated game. So there we have it, my take on Shinra, which I think was a unique and excellent adaptation of the classic evil empire element of Final Fantasy games that has been ushered thoughtfully into the realms of the sci-fi and the unique Final Fantasy VII world. And I think it persists as one of the best world-building and antagonistic elements that we've seen in Final Fantasy games to date. If you got this far, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And please consider sharing, subscribing, and drop a comment to let me know your thoughts. Shinra.